Hank, can we start by asking you how your passion for music and for guitar playing developed?
My passion for music, I suppose it started when I was in my early teen years. I did play piano for a little bit, for 2.5 years, from 8 to 10.5. Foolishly gave it up because I would prefer to be out playing with the other kids, playing football or soccer, as the Americans refer to it, or other games on the street. And I was tinkling away on the keys, you know, so it didn't sit well with me. So I gave it up when I went to grammar school, saying that homework would be far too much and I couldn't do the two. I regretted that later. But listening to the radio, we didn't get a great deal of music in those days on the radio, certainly not popular music as we now understand it. It was some of the pop music of the day, which often was not very exciting. But what I did like, I started listening to some of the big bands like Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, people like that. We did hear that on the radio, and that started to excite me. Then I heard a little bit of folk blues, people like Lead Belly, Big Bill Broonzy, Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, and I started to really get involved in that sort of music. And then when skiffle came on the scene in about 1956 or 7 with Lonnie Donegan, he was in a sense commercializing that kind of American folk music. And around that time I was already into New Orleans jazz, Chicago jazz. And I wanted to play clarinet, couldn't afford a clarinet, nor would I have afforded the lessons. So what I decided to do was just listen to it. And then one day at school, a teacher said to me, our music teacher, after the music lesson, was talking about my interest in jazz and that American music of that style. And he happened to mention that he had a banjo. My ears pricked up, and I said, "Do you want to sell it?" And he said, "Well, actually, yes." He played piano, you see. So anyway, I said, "How much do you want?" He said, £2.10. I said, "Done, but I can only pay you £0.50 a week." He said, "No problem." And he brought it to school the next day. I was fascinated by this instrument, because to me that was the way into playing in a jazz band. Long story short, I learned a few chords, and I started playing in some local jazz bands, and one of them, I was the second banjo player. We had 2 banjos, and the other guy was probably in his 30s, and he knew a lot of chords and a lot of sequences, and he helped me a lot in learning chord shapes and things. And so my interest in music then became very, very strong. Then I got into the skiffle thing. I formed a skiffle group at school. We used to go around to youth clubs on a Friday night. I'd knock on the door of the church youth club, go in, say, "Look, we have a skiffle group, can we play for you?" They'd go, "Yeah, come in." And we thought that was magic. We'd play for about half an hour, and they'd give us tea and biscuits, and we thought this was paradise. And so that's how my passion started to really develop then. But also at that point, one of the guys in the skiffle group played guitar, but he was actually a pianist. So he started to lend me his guitar, and I learned a few chords, and I was doubling on banjo and guitar in the skiffle group, which everyone thought was very impressive. Even I did.
So when did you get your first guitar?
My father bought me a guitar in 1957 for my 16th birthday, and coincidentally the guitar cost 16 guineas. It was a Hofner Congress, I think they were called, the cheapest Hofner, supposedly an arch top, smallish body, high action, but it was fantastic to have my own instrument. And once I got that guitar, because the other guitar was just being lent to me when we did the odd gig, I used to listen to records. Let me rephrase that. I had a few jazz records. I'd listen to those and try to copy things on that. But also the radio. I used to listen to music on the radio, and by then this sort of rock and roll thing was beginning to happen. And whilst there wasn't much of it on the radio, when there was, I used to listen and try to remember the tunes and learn to play the tune. And if there was a particular phrase that was being repeated, like a sax phrase, a motif, I tried to learn that, and that's how I started to try to play tunes on the guitar. And then I bought a tiny little pickup which screwed on the end of the neck, and it had a lead coming off it, and I managed to acquire a very small amplifier which was about the size of a cornflake packet, and didn't sound much better. A lot of crackles and pops, and I thought that was wonderful. And then so I joined another skiffle group with a colleague of mine from school, and that was a group and where we actually got paid when we did some work. That was in 1957, early 58.
Can you provide your feelings about the impact of Buddy Holly and what his music meant to you when you first heard it?
With the skiffle movement in jazz, I was then beginning to listen to rock and roll, and those early rockers, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, and then we had the white artists who came from a different kind of background, like the Everly Brothers, Elvis Presley, Gene Vincent, and of course Buddy Holly and the Crickets. I remember the first time I heard the Crickets, we had a little milk bar near the school, coffee shop we call them now I suppose, and they had a jukebox, and I was chatting with some friends, and the opening bars of That'll Be the Day came on, and my ears pricked up. It was quite a stunning sound, and it was a cracking record at the time, and on those jukeboxes there was a lot of bottom end, and it really pumped out, and that was it. I became a Buddy Holly fan, and a little while later I got my first electric gramophone. Before that I had a wind-up gramophone that someone gave me. I got a little Dansette portable gramophone, and I bought the Crickets' first album, The Chirping Crickets, and I started to try to learn all the guitar parts on that, the chords and any solos and so forth, and of course the songs, and Bruce and I learned most of those songs. So Buddy was a big influence, and I think what was helpful too for many of us was that Buddy wasn't the obvious rock and roll star in the style of, say, an Elvis Presley or someone of that nature. He wore glasses, which was helpful for someone like me. You think, well, hey, I can be a rock musician and wear glasses. Although I was told, interestingly, in 1959 when we were touring with Cliff, a guy called Denny Wright, you might not remember the name, very fine British guitarist. He played with Lonnie Donegan, and he was then with a guy called Johnny Duncan, an American guy, had a couple of big hits in the sort of almost skiffle type hits, Last Train to San Fernando. And Denny took me on one side one night and he said, "Hank, can I give you some advice?" I thought it was going to be about playing. I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't wear your glasses on stage." He said, "People don't wear specs on stage." And I said, "Well, I'm nearly blind, I'm so short-sighted, I'll fall off the stage." He said, "Doesn't matter." I said, "Well, it does to me." Anyway, I'm glad I didn't listen to him and continued to wear it. So yeah, Buddy had musically a huge influence, along with some of the others that I mentioned, but certainly Buddy, and his vocal approach and everything was a little different, and that was good. Over the years, I suppose there have been a number of career highlights. I mean, obviously, having our first hit record with Apache was interesting, to say the least, particularly as it was an instrumental, because we were signed to Columbia Records primarily as a vocal instrumental group, in much of the ways the Beatles were later on. So we, and the record just before Apache was almost a hit. It was a vocal. And it was pure chance that we were offered Apache by the composer Jerry Lauded, who was on tour with us, and it was an interesting meeting because he asked us if we were going to do any more recording. We said, yeah. In fact, when we finish this tour, we're supposed to be in the studio, so we're going to try to write some songs. He said, "Are you interested in an instrumental?" We said, "Well, yeah, why not?" He used to compose on a ukulele. He had this little, got it out, and he just strummed the chords, and he sang the tune down, 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 down. And Jet Harris and myself, who was then the bass player in the Shadows, thought, wow, this is a great tune. And we got Bruce Welsh and Tony Meehan, the drummer, to have a listen. We all loved it, and we decided that so we arranged it, And in those days, I was usually given the task of coming up with an intro for a song. So I had this idea of da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, which everyone liked, and we did that. And then I'm glad to say it was a hit. But interestingly, our record producer did not want that as the A-side. There was another tune called Quartermaster Stores, which was more along the lines of almost a Johnny and the Hurricanes type, da-da-da-da-da-da stuff. And we thought it was very ordinary. And Apache was different. And he played it around, got a fantastic reaction to it, and said, "Yeah, you're right. We'll put this out as the A-side." And we had our first big hit. And then, but it was always an amazing thing when other records were hits. One highlight, I think, for us too. Well, a couple more I'd just like to mention. We were on tour in the 70s, and we decided to do a version of Don't Cry For Me Argentina, an instrumental version, which had been a huge hit. And it was, in our performance, I always did one or two numbers where they were more ballad-like, and I'd use the volume pedal and stand at the front, and it was something different from all the up-tempo stuff and medium-tempo stuff. And we did the arrangement, and we did it, and to us it was just a little feature on stage. And from the first night of the tour, the reaction to it was like, wow, what's going on here? I mean, people were shouting out, record it, record it. And we had a guy who saw, I think, the third night of the tour. He was from one of the big wholesalers in the UK who ordered all the records and everything. And he said, look, he said, this is a hit. I'm telling you, I've never seen a reaction like it. It was every night. And he ordered several 100,000, and it was a monster hit. And that was one of those unexpected things. Another highlight for me was we did Wembley Stadium in 1989, I think it was, with Cliff. And in our part of the performance that evening, when we did the Shadows set, it was just beginning, dusk was coming in, the light was, it was in June, so it stays very light in the UK till very late. And we'd been doing a lot of the hits, and I introduced the theme from The Deer Hunter, Cavatina. I thought, this is going to go well, because they're all rocking, you know, and you think, here we go. But it was quite remarkable. It got a response as soon as I mentioned the title. Then as we started to play, it just went, you could hear a pin drop, and just seeing people, you know, just gently swaying the couples. It was a lovely moment. Yeah, that was, so sometimes these little things like that, well, I guess they're more than little things, the effect a piece of music can have on an audience is a remarkable thing. Yeah.
Do you recall when you discovered or got your first Stratocaster?
I do. My first Stratocaster was bought directly from the US. There was a trade embargo in existence at the time. And any American musical instrument in the UK was either brought in privately, often by merchant sailors, or was an old one that was there before the embargo was put in place. I had a cheapo Japanese guitar called an Antoria. And what I liked about it, it looked like a rock and roll guitar. The body looked like a miniature Les Paul. And the headstock looked like a badly made Fender headstock with all the machine heads on one side. And the neck looked like it had been made by Fred Flintstone. It was chunky, and it was, there was far too much relief on the neck. So as you started to go up to about the 5th fret, the action was getting higher, then it would go higher, then it would go lower again. And it wasn't the easiest thing to play, but it looked like a rock and roll guitar. And at that time, in 1959, I was thinking about getting another guitar. Cliff said, look, he said, Hank, I'd like to get you a guitar. What do you reckon? And we thought, well, two people came to mind. One was Buddy Holly. We'd seen that photograph on the Crickets album with this amazing looking guitar, which we didn't know what it was. The other guy that at that time I was really getting very keenly interested in was James Burton with Ricky Nelson. And we'd heard he played a Fender, so we thought, right, let's go for a Fender. So Cliff's management got the brochure from the US, direct from the factory. We poured over this brochure, all this stuff in it. And when we came to the guitar pages, it had this photograph of a red Strat. That's the one that Buddy Holly uses. We recognized the shape. And we assumed that James Burton used the same guitar because it was the most expensive. So we ordered this guitar. It was red. I've now learned it was called Roman red apparently at that period. Red guitar with a beautiful bird's eye maple neck and fingerboard, gold-plated hardware, and the so-called tremolo arm, which is a vibrato bar really. So yeah, we ordered that. A few weeks later it arrived in this beautiful tweed case, and we just opened it and just looked at it for a few minutes. It looked so amazing. And then got it out and tried to play it. And the most disappointing thing initially for me with that was the weight of the strings. I think I've learned subsequently that, well, I know I've learned from what I was told that they were 13s to 56s or something, and they were pretty heavy strings. And with the Fender scale, the Antori had a shorter scale, so it was a bit easier to bend. Anyway, that was but for me, getting a guitar was a big thing. And the whammy bar was an interesting piece of equipment for me, because one thing I used to like about classical guitars was they always had this vibrato. You know, they could roll the vibrato with an Allen string. You couldn't really do that on heavy metal steel strings on a guitar. And I found out with the whammy bar I could put a vibrato on. But I also found out, because the heavy strings, all I could do, the only string I could really bend was the second string, up a half step. But as I bent it, if I pulled the arm up, because I had a gap under the thing so you could pull the bar up, I could pull it the whole tone, the whole step. And also I could dip the string, you know, hit a string, dip it down, and get more expression, or do some really wild sounds on it just by shaking it. If I run out of ideas, give it a good shake, you know. Yeah, so that was important. Then, of course, I got the Echo Box and things like that, which completed the package. The Vox guitar, the Echo Box, with all those different kind of multi-head echoes, and the Strat. And yeah, so that was an important guitar for me, very important. Without that, I wouldn't have developed the style I did, which really means I have to use that whammy bar all the time.
Throughout that are particularly meaningful?
Well, instruments over the years that would be meaningful to me would obviously be my banjo, because I still have it, funnily enough. But being the gentleman I am, I don't use it. I still got the hanging in my study. Unfortunately, the first guitar I bought, which obviously was very, very important, I gave away at some point, I think, which sadly. The Stratocaster, obviously. I'm also interested in gypsy jazz. And I have a whole collection of good gypsy jazz guitars, and they're important to me in that style of music. They have a particular sound, which is not the same as an American style flat top guitar, different sound, although they're a lot easier to play, I will say that, having a shorter scale and everything. But yeah, they're all instruments which to me are part of what I do. And I've also had some good acoustic guitars, which I've used when I used to tour with my band on stage. I used to do some acoustic work, as well as the electric stuff. And I had a couple of Matons, which are very nice instruments, made here in Australia.
What was the instrument hit recording era like for you?
The period of the early 60s, probably from the late 50s, there seemed to be an interest in instrumental music, rock and roll instrumentals, and even in the UK, a revival of New Orleans style jazz. And we had some jazz artists like Kenny Ball and Acapulco who started having hit records in the early 60s. Pianists like Russ Conway had a few big hits. And that probably played its part in the interest of instrumental music when Apache came out. And so once we had that hit, you know, it's always difficult to follow up a hit record. We were offered by our record producer a piece of music that had been a hit in the US, which we really loved, but we didn't want to copy it. Apache was still high on the charts. It would mean we'd have to record it, release it quickly, and we didn't want to do that. Also, we didn't want to cover American songs. We wanted to try to have originals. That was Walk Don't Run by the Ventures, which became a big hit. Then fortunately at that point, because of the success of Apache, we had, which always happens with an artist or a band who are successful, you have other people who are writers, composers, tendering material. We had a great tune called Man of Mystery, which was the theme song to a big British crime series called the Edgar Wallace Mysteries. And we did a different arrangement on that from the way it was portrayed as the theme music. And that became, and that's one where I used the shaking of the wangy bar to start it off, sort of bending the second string up to you know, the same pitch as the first string, and then giving it a good shake. And then FBI, we wrote a thing called FBI, which was a big hit. And it was a remarkable period because, as I say, there was a huge interest in instrumentals. And also that it wasn't just a British success. We're fortunate we're having hits in many, many different territories. Unfortunately, not in the US, I'm sorry to say. We couldn't get the promo at the time. Our US company, also Columbia, would release it, but they wouldn't promote it. Said, no, it's just American music. We've got plenty of that here, you know. So, but we had hits throughout Europe, Scandinavia, Asia, Africa, places like that. So it was a big international thing for us, and for Cliff, of course. And it was an exciting period because, one, we're having hit after hit after hit, which I always found remarkable because you always think this hit is your last one. And sometimes we'd have a #1 record and I'm thinking, really? Because I would prefer one of the other records, which was now perhaps at #2, and we were holding it off. You say, well, hey, who am I to argue with the public? But it was an exciting period, yeah. But I think we all knew that sooner or later this interest in instrumentals was going to wane, which it did eventually, obviously. And so it got harder and harder to get big hit singles as the 60s went on. And as things always happen in any industry, and certainly in the music industry, in the entertainment industry, things started changing. New faces come on the scene. The Beatles came on the scene with fantastic music, great songs, a fairly raw sort of sound, a different look. And then the Rolling Stones came on the scene, and then they changed their image to become this sort of more rebellious image, which was a clever move. And we could see the whole thing changing. But interestingly, we had a couple of vocal hits during this time, and we recorded a song in 1965, I think, called Don't Make My Baby Blue, which Bruce found. And we recorded it. It was a top 5 hit, and I remember bumping into George Harrison at Abbey Road Studios, because we'd known the Beatles from before they got really big. You know, we used to hang around a lot together in the early days. And he said, "Oh, I love the new record." He said, "You know," he said, "seriously, Hank," he said, "forget the instrumentals and concentrate on vocals." What does he know, you know? So we didn't take his advice, unfortunately, but it probably was the way to go at that point. You know, having a big hit like that is to follow up with another one in the same vein, maybe. But we didn't.
And do you still enjoy touring and performing and recording? Something you're still doing?
I haven't done much touring for a while. I did my final tour with my band 2002. Then we reformed The Shadows and did we'd never done a farewell tour. Things sort of collapsed due to problems within the band. We had a really good year in 1980. I had a platinum album, 2 big tours, Europe and the UK, and then because of internal problems, we gave up the ghost. And then we got together to do what we thought was a good thing on a personal level, but on the fan level, do farewell tour, which we did in Europe and the UK. Sadly, we didn't come out to Australia, New Zealand, Asia, etc., which we would like to have done, but we kind of decided we'd had enough again. And then we did the Cliff and the Shadows reunion stuff a few years ago, which was a much more wider tour, which was fabulous fun and very successful. Since then, I haven't done anything in the way of touring, apart from a couple of little mini tours with my Gypsy Jazz Quartet, mainly in the eastern states of Australia and New Zealand. Done that a couple of times, but the last one was about 2.5 years ago. But no more plans to do anything at the moment. I came to Perth due to a typing error. I was supposed to be going to Penrith in the UK, and they got the wrong spelling, and I ended up in Perth. Now, the reason we came to Perth was that after traveling around the world for decades, you get the opportunity to see a lot of different countries, cultures, and realize that the UK is not the only place with lovely countryside. And we decided that we wanted to move to somewhere warmer. I don't like the cold very much. I get very cold fingers. I've got Raynaud's syndrome, so if the temperature drops, they get very cold and stiff. Bit like my brain at the moment. And we were building a house in Menorca, but then we found out with our two youngest that there weren't any English-speaking schools there. That was going to be a problem. So what we decided to do was rethink. We sold the property there and decided that we would consider Australia, because they can almost speak English in Australia, so it would be easier for the kids. And we, as it turned out, we had a lot of Australian friends. And our then manager, Shadows manager, Peter Gormley, who was in fact an Australian, a wonderful man. He was a tremendous manager for us, and almost like a father figure in many ways. And he said, go to Perth. And I like Perth anyway. I'd seen it develop from what looked like Halifax in the UK with Sun in 1961 to a much more vibrant city. Great beaches, Swan Valley down the road, less people. And I prefer places where you've got more space to move, less people. The southeast of England is just very high numbers of people. So we made that decision that we'd come here. We found some property, built a house up in the hills, and never regretted the move.